Great to have you back as we're continuing our studies of Greek. We're coming this time to chapter 31 of Machen's text. The end is in sight. We're coming at this point to a very important chapter, however. The class of verbs that is going to be introduced in this chapter is called the class of verbs. They're me verbs. We've only had one me verb so far. That was the word eimi. You recall earlier it was the verb of being. But there is a class of verbs in the New Testament that end in mu iota, and they're called the me verbs. And the first one that we're going to be encountering, and really the only one in this chapter that we're going to be looking at, is the verb didomi, and various cognates of that using various prepositions and compound formations of that verb, which all have to do with some notion of giving over, giving back, that sort of thing. The word didomi simply means to give. It is quite irregular as compared to the other verbs that we've studied. Within the me verb class, there's a fair amount of regularity, but you're going to see that the endings are at least enough different from what we've seen already that it is going to take a little bit of extra work to really get these endings mastered. Let me once again urge you, however, to take the time necessary to do so. You're going to find as you read the New Testament that there are a fair number of verbs that do in fact use this ending. In fact, in the next chapter, chapter 32, Machen is going to give you something like a half a dozen more verbs, all of which have this me ending. And so what we're learning in this chapter is simply the basics of how this verb is conjugated. And then we'll find that those skills, of course, carry over to the other verbs that we're going to be looking at. There's a few other details that Machen includes in this text, and we'll consider those as we go along, and we'll spend some time in the exercises. But mainly, this chapter involves simply getting a feel for and a mastery of the 6 principal parts that are connected with the me verb and the various conjugations. There's actually a fair amount to learn here, but you're not adding any new concepts, just simply some new forms of ideas that you've already mastered before. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll take a look at the vocabulary list. We'll kind of amble through the chapter briefly, and then we'll look at the exercises. And once again, I'll let you take it from there. So let's look at the vocabulary list first of all. So here we have the vocabulary list. We'll notice that the first word that is given to us by Machen is the word aionios. Of course, we already had ion, ionos, and so on related to this. This happens to be an adjective. And you'll notice that both the masculine and feminine are identical, and it's only the neuter that is different. So in some ways it makes this word a little easier to master, but it simply means eternal, and it's an adjective. It's used to apply to words like eternal life and so on. So you're going to find that in the exercises, and certainly you'll find it as well frequently in the New Testament. Anti is the word that means instead of. We, of course, have in English the prefix anti, which usually means against, and that is, in fact, another alternative meaning of this. But I think it's worth noting that the primary use of this preposition, which is used, by the way, with the genitive, is instead of. This has, of course, caused some scholars to speculate that when we read in the New Testament of that mysterious character who's known as the Antichristos, the Antichrist, maybe it's not so much someone who opposes Christ as someone who tries to replace Christ, you see, stepping in instead of Christ. I'll leave that to your own speculations for further study, but nevertheless it is an interesting angle on it, and it would certainly be more consistent with the normal use of that preposition anti. We have the first of our me verbs here, and you know what I'm going to do is simply drop down, and we'll look at the first of these here, didomi, which is the standard form of that verb. We're going to see the ways in which it's conjugated later, but just for now, make note of the fact that that word didomi means to give. And then we have various forms of it. So for example, back up here, apodidomi means I give back. I give back what is owed or promised. I render or I pay. It has the idea of repayment, literally to give from. But the apo in that sense is actually implying more the idea of a return. So to return something, to give it back. Gune, of course, the word for woman. We've been able to form various expressions of the idea of woman, like a this woman, that idea using the demonstrative pronoun. But now for the first time we actually get this word gune. We have, of course, in English the word gynecologist and misogyny, certain words that use this Greek word as their root. You'll notice that it is declined according to the third declension here, so it's gune, gunaikos, and we'll be seeing some of that as we go through the exercises. We've already looked at didomi, I give. Here's a word that's interesting. This is the second aorist of gnosko, and as he notes here, it is of the me form. You wouldn't be able to tell that simply by looking at the form here, but this is how the aorist of the word gnosko is formed. You may have noticed in the exercises we've never actually seen the aorist of the word gnosko. We've used it in the present, we've used it in the future, the deponent future gnosomai, but we haven't had the aorist yet, and that's because it is quite irregular, and it actually takes its form using the me form, and so now we're in a position to actually add this to our repertoire. We have the word exousia. This means authority. You'll notice by simply examining it that we have the prefix, which is the word ek, with the gazi here, eggs, out of, and then ousia, of course, from the participle for the verb of being means out of being. And so literally authority in the Greek idiom was that which expresses itself out of being or out of stuff or out of substance, something that has a kind of intrinsic weight or dignity about it that gives it authority. That is, of course, I think helpful in the New Testament. We find that, for example, people would say of Jesus that he spoke with exousia. He spoke with substance or weight, or spoke out of that kind of inherent authority that he had, and it does shed an interesting light on some of the uses of that word in the New Testament. We have the word eskon, which is the second aorist of echo. Once again, we've had echo before, of course. It was in our first vocabulary list, but we have not been able to form its aorist until now. And so here we have the second aorist of it. It's eskon. Zao, which means I live. We've had the word zoe, which is the word for life, of course. So this is in some ways simply a verb form of that particular word. It has eta instead of alpha in the present system. And so you're going to find that it shows up looking something like that. And so we're going to be dealing with that in the vocabulary or in the exercises as well as we go along. Idu simply means to look or behold. It's an exclamation, a kind of particle that will show up. Oftentimes in the New Testament, we of course have the word behold or look, and that's the word that's commonly used in that setting. Up here we have monos, which means alone or only. It's an adjective used frequently in the New Testament, and so simply learn that. Of course, our English prefix mono is taken from that, so it shouldn't be too hard to master it. Mysterion is the word for mystery. It's a neuter noun. Finds itself in the New Testament somewhat frequently. Of course, we hear often of the mystery of the gospel, which typically is connected to the idea that the Messiah would come not simply for a Jewish population, but for the Gentiles as well, who would become members in good standing of the Commonwealth of Israel. That was the mystery that was hid for ages and for generations, but now was made known to the saints, as Paul says over in the book of Ephesians. That's the word mysterion. Harao, we've alluded to this before, of course. It's related to the word blepo. In fact, it is synonymous with it. Some of the other forms of the word blepo, of course, are actually based on this particular word. For example, the future opsomai is actually taken from harao, but because of its synonymity to the word blepo, we find that both of them are used more or less interchangeably. So that's one we finally will be dealing with here. The word paradidomi is another form of the word didomi, of course, and it means to deliver over, often with the idea of judgment in view, so to deliver over for some kind of justice. You may recall Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that for this reason God delivered them over to their own passions, that idea. And the implication there is that that was an act of judgment on God's part. Sorry, I kind of wrote through this here. Paradzo, which means I tempt. We have the idea of being tempted in the New Testament, of course, on many occasions. Poios is an interrogative pronoun used in questions, and it's simply asking the question of what sort. And it can have a feminine form and a neuter form, as we would expect, and so that's a word simply that you'll be using as you go along, and you want to be sure to master that. Simon and Simonos, third declension, is the word Simon, the name of Peter, of course, in the New Testament. And finally, Kairos, you know the word chiropractor, a physician who works with his hands, and that's where the idea of the chiropractor came from chir and kairos, which of course means hand. All right, coming to page 201, we notice here that Machen notes that the me verbs, we've looked at a me of course already, form a different class of verbs. The other class are the omega verbs. Everything we've studied so far has been an omega verb, and in fact there's only one other conjugation of verbs in the Greek language, as Machen notes right there, and this is the me conjugation. Certainly much less frequent than the omega verbs, but frequent enough that it's well worth your time to go ahead and master this, and so don't blow it off. Be aware of its importance. He notes here something that is worth paying attention to. Verbs in me differ from verbs in omega only in the present and the second aorist system. So otherwise you're going to find that there's a whole lot of similarity here, that this is not utterly different in every one of the principal parts, but only especially in the present and in the second aorist, which we'll be looking at in some detail as we go along. Well, we know all 6 of the principal parts, and so Machen gives all of them to us at this point. So we have the present, which is didomi. We have the future, which is doso. We have the aorist, which is edoka. We have the perfect, which is dedoka. We have the perfect, middle and passive, which is dedomai. And then we have the aorist passive, which also is the root of the future passive, which is edothane. So just looking those over, you're going to notice immediately that we're seeing at least predictably some similarities to things that we've already studied. The chief difference is going to be right here with didomi, and of course, as he notes up here, the second aorist will differ. So let's take a look at these individually. He notes that the stem of didomi is the delta omicron. He says if this were an omega verb, then it would actually be a contract verb and would look like that, da-o. But in this case, it's not a contract verb, it's a me verb, and the stem is simply delta omicron, and we'll come back to that when we look at the present system in a moment. The future, you'll notice, is doso, and he says it's entirely regular. You've already learned the future system, and it has the sigma, plus the normal endings that otherwise apply in the present, as you know. So we have doso, doses, dose, dosomen, dosita, dososi. Those are all regular, and so we're going to find no surprises there as we go through the future of this. The first aorist, edoka, is formed quite regularly. The only difference is that instead of a sigma, which we would normally find in the aorist, of course we find over here, as he notes, the kappa. So it's edoka, edokas, edoka, and so on. When we get to the perfect active, we have dedoka, and it's entirely regular, and really the only difference is we have what looks like a reduplication there at the beginning, and that indeed is what it is. So that's not too easy to, or not too difficult to master. And the perfect middle and passive, dedomai, again, is going to be quite regular, except that the final vowel is not lengthened, and we'll see some examples of that as we go along. And finally, he gives us at paragraph 490 that the aorist passive, edothane, is also quite regular, and so we've learned the aorist passive, and we're going to find that the endings are pretty much predictable there. So again, don't be too put off by this didomi verb. It's not going to be quite as difficult or as many new endings as one might have supposed at the beginning, but certainly the present system is going to be somewhat different from what we've seen before. So let's take a look at it. Here's the present active indicative of didomi, and you'll notice the first person singular, didomi, and then didos, and then didosi. So it's a little surprising. That would have been, we would think, a third person plural ending, but in this case it's the first person, or the third person singular. Didomi, didos, didosi. Over here, didomen, well, that looks familiar. Didota, that looks kind of familiar. And then didaosi. Didaosi, of course, unexpected. There's no contraction here. We keep the omicron separate from the alpha, so it's going to be simply, as you see it here, with the third person plural endings. Dropping down to paragraph 496, you want to read these intervening paragraphs here, but I think they're self-explanatory. We have the present active subjunctive, and you'll notice that it's dido, didos, dido, with the iota subscript, didomen, didota, didosi. So it's not too difficult. It's the subjunctive, and so in the present system, you'll find that showing up fairly frequently. And continuing here, we now have the present active imperative, and this is fairly similar to what we saw in the imperative chapter. Didu, didoto, didoti, or didota, and didotosan is the present active imperative. You'll notice the irregular accent as you're going through that. The present active participle, we have deduce, dedusa, didone. And then notice that he gives you the genitive as well, because of course you're going to need that to form the rest of the endings. But knowing the genitive in each case, from there you can triangulate the rest of the endings. And so that's pretty much all you need to know to do the present active participle. The imperfect active, which is considered part of the present system, not too dissimilar from what we've already learned. Edidun, edidus, edidu, edidomen, edidota, edidosan, and so those are the imperfect endings. All right, looking at the aorist now, he notes this paragraph, quite important to make a note of this, paragraph 506. The aorist active of didomi is peculiar in that it's the first aorist in the indicative, but the second aorist in all the other moods. And so you need to just keep your eye on that. That tends to be the case throughout. The aorist active, then you notice here, edoka, edokos, edoken, edokamen, edokate, edokan. And so the endings, pretty much what we've already learned. When we move then to other moods, however, things change a bit. Here's the aorist active subjunctive, and it's do, dos, do, domen, dota, dosi. This is the subjunctive, the aorist active subjunctive. The aorist active imperative, we have dos, doto, dota, dotosan. Again, somewhat similar to the aorist imperative that we learned in a prior chapter. The aorist active infinitive, dunai, to give. The aorist active participle, these are the endings, dus, dusa, don. It's declined just like the present, except, of course, you don't have that delta, epsilon, delta right at the beginning. And he doesn't mention the aorist middle, which is quite rare in the New Testament. So that's really it. Hopefully that'll get you going, and as you work on the me verbs, you're going to find that these principles pretty much apply throughout this entire system. The second aorist of gnosko is formed according to the me form, and he indicates that you might want to go back and take a look at the conjugation in paragraph 601 at the back of the book. I won't take time to do that, but you should take a look at it, and you'll find that it does form itself more or less according to the lines that we've already indicated. All right, a couple of other details here as we're wrapping up this chapter. This is an idiom that you see in the New Testament quite frequently, and it's worth learning to recognize it. And so we have this particular use in which you have the article ho da apokrythe. And in this case, the word ho, which is an article, is actually translated by he. But he answered them. That would be the idea. They asked him, this is the question, and he answered them. It's idiomatic. The article there is actually being translated as the pronoun he. This is not the same use of the article that we saw earlier in the case of participles and elsewhere. The walking down the street man, you might say the man who walked down the street, that idea. This is actually idiomatic, but it's quite common. And so you want to get a hold of it. Whenever it's used in this particular arrangement, there is a little bit of an emphasis on this. Usually it'll be a "but he answered" kind of arrangement. So they asked him this, they asked him that, but he answered. A little emphasis on the he. We'll see that in the exercise, and you certainly see it fairly frequently in the New Testament. The other detail that Machen develops here on page 206 is what he calls the aorist participle, denoting the same act as the leading verb. This is very common, especially in the form that you're seeing it right here. And so you notice this. What does it say? Literally, having answered, he said, Jesus. And so Jesus, having answered, said. But it is almost always translated with these two verbs more or less in apposition to each other, that is, parallel to each other. Jesus answered and said. That's the idiomatic sense of it. You'll know in the New Testament that many times you have that particular expression, Jesus answered and said to them this and that, and that's the way that you'll generally always find it. So just make a note of that. The exercises will cover that, but it is something to bear in mind as you're reading the New Testament. You want to read over Machen's remaining discussion of that point, but I will skip down here to paragraph 521, where he mentions first aorist endings on second aorist stems. This is quite common in the New Testament. Probably the most common expression of it is the verb apan. We've, of course, learned apon, which is the second aorist of lego, I say or I said, or they said in this particular form. But all he's pointing out is that when you actually get into the New Testament, you'll often find that the ending is the alpha ending and basically follows the alpha endings throughout. That's rather important. He's more or less avoided that throughout the book because he wanted to have a consistent use of the second aorist here on apon, but you're going to find in the New Testament that actually this is probably as common as the other, if not more so. And so be aware of that. Don't be thrown off by it as you see it in the New Testament. So let's drop down to the first of the exercises here, paragraph 522. And we have peredoka. We immediately recognize that is, of course, a form of the didomi verb. This is the aorist. And, of course, you know the aorist is regular throughout. We have the kappa instead of the sigma. Paradidomi means to deliver over. We talked about that, sometimes used in connection with being delivered over to judgment, but it can also imply the idea of a tradition, and that's really the sense that Paul is emphasizing here. So peredoka, I delivered over, gar, postpositive, for I delivered over, humen, to you, the dative plural, in protois, in the first instance or among the first things. It's idiomatic, but something that wants to emphasize that in the first place, kind of in the highest priority of things that I gave to you, in the very first position. For I delivered over to you in the first place, ho, the relative pronoun, that which kai also paralaban, which is I received. And so we have the second aorist of lambano. So I delivered over to you that which I also received. Hoti, that Christos, Christ. Apethanen, second aorist from apothnesko, died. Huper, on behalf of, with the genitive, ton hamartion, the sins, hemon, of us. Kata, according to, with the accusative, tas graphos, according to the scriptures. So everything here is pretty easy except the new use of the verb here, didomi, in its various forms, so hopefully that didn't throw you off very much. That's really the only thing here that is going to be unusual in that particular exercise. All right, continuing now, the next exercise, which actually goes over to the next page. We'll have to kind of work through this as we can, but we have me ekontos. This, of course, is the participle. It's the genitive, singular, masculine. And with the autu there, we, of course, detect that this is a genitive absolute in play with the infinitive of the word apodunai, to pay back. And so he had nothing with which to pay back. He, having, not having to pay back, you see, meaning having nothing, no wherewithal or resources by which to pay back. You have to kind of read a little bit into that, but that's the idea. He not having anything or any means by which to pay back. Then we have ho here. The rest of the sentence you can see in the book, ho kurios autou, the Lord of him, or his Lord, apelusin, released, from apeluo, released him. So he, having nothing with which to repay, his Lord released him. All right, and finally, let's take a look at number 3 here. We have kai and apokrythes. Ho laos is the subject, so the people. And this, you notice, is the aorist participle, but this is a case similar to what we looked at just a moment ago, in which it's being used more or less in parallel to apen. So we're going to translate it, the people answered and said. That's not quite literal, but nevertheless that's the way it's commonly rendered, and probably is the closest sense of that in the English language. So all the people answered and said, tohaima, the blood autou of him, ephemas, implied in there, be on us, or the blood of him be on us, kai, epi ta tekna hemon, that very chilling statement taken from Matthew's gospel, the blood of him be upon us and upon our children. And so we have a good expression of, a kind of idiomatic example of that use of apokrythes in parallel with the word apen, as it commonly shows up in the New Testament. All right, let's take a look at the composition exercises. This is on page 209. The first of them reads, the woman besought the apostle that he might give her something. So here we have the use of the word hegune, the woman. This is, of course, a feminine noun. It's in the nominative here, the subject of the sentence, the woman. Besought, begged, beseeched. Parakaleo is the word. This is in the aorist, so we have the lengthening there of the contract vowel. The woman besought, parakalese, besought ton apostolon, the apostle, hina, to the effect that, as we've seen before, he might give her. So here we have the subjunctive, and you go back and check that in the book, you'll see that that's the idea. So hina, of course, takes the subjunctive, that he might give her, and that's the subjunctive form of that word do, then, that he might give aute to her te, something, the indefinite pronoun. So the woman besought him, that the apostle, that he might give her something. The rest of it reads, but he answered her nothing. This is very commonly the idea, ho de apokrythe, but he, using the article there in that particular sense that we talked about earlier, but he answered her, apokrythe, from apokrynomai, of course, the deponent verb used in the aorist here, so it has the aorist passive form, but he answered aute, feminine pronoun, uden, nothing. Second example we have, those who had killed the woman said that they had known the king. We'll take that much first of all. Those who had killed the woman, so the having killed, this of course is a participle, aorist, lengthens the stem there. The having killed, with the aorist ending, nominative, plural, the having killed, tas gunekos, the women. It's plural. I think I read that singular there a moment ago, but it should be plural, and you can check for the declension of that word gune, and that would be the accusative plural of it, gunekos. Those who had killed the women said that, hoti, egnosan, they knew, or they had known, ton basileia, the king. And then going on from there, but he answered and said that he was not willing to give them what they asked. But he answered, same kind of idiom, we'll use that, but he answered, apokrythes apen. That's very common in the New Testament, but he answered and said. And so that's the way you want to render that, even though it looks like it might translate slightly differently if you did it more literally. But he answered and said that, who he did not wish. Of course, we put the indirect discourse into the tense in which we originally found it, so literally he does not wish, but we translate it in the aorist. He did not wish to give, dune, the infinitive there, autois, to them. This is the, of course, dative plural. That which, relative pronoun, aitusi. They were asking. Again, we're using the tense of the original discourse here. And so the word aiteo becomes aitusi in the third person's plural. All right, so let's take a look at the last of these compositions that we'll be treating here. If we believe on him who loved us and gave himself in behalf of us, we shall have eternal life instead of death. So if we believe on him who loved us, we're going to put this in the indicative, so we're going to use a rather than ian, because I think the supposition there is that we actually do believe on him, and so we're going to not use the subjunctive. So it's going to be the simple present tense, first person plural, if pistuomen, we believe, eis ton agape santa. Notice it's the aorist participle, masculine, singular. So if we believe on him who loved, hemas us, and donta, if we believe on him who loved us, and gave, this is the aorist, gave, heauton, himself, who per hemon, on our behalf, we shall have eternal life. Future tense, exomen, we shall have zoein ionion, we've looked at that, life eternal. Anti, of course, the preposition instead of takes the genitive, thanatu, instead of death. So I think that's pretty straightforward. Again, the only tricky part was that word right there, and if you just follow through the conjugation of didomi in the chapter, I think you'll see how we came up with that. So hopefully that'll be enough to get you going. As always, I provided to you the answer key and the chapters, so go ahead and download those, work through the exercises, and be sure to check your work as you're going along. So once you're finished with that, go ahead and come on back and we'll take a look at chapter 32, and we'll keep pressing on toward the end of our studies of New Testament Greek. So until then, God's richest blessing on you as you continue your studies of the Greek language.